Hello class, welcome to your lecture on the Axial Age, myth in Genesis, and the Divine Feminine in Judeo-Christian myth. Normally in any philosophy or humanities class, the historical timeline is divided into pre-modern and post-modern. Almost all intellectual history is seen as happening between 600 BCE and the Renaissance and the present day. When it comes to the study of myth, however, the major turning point is the Axial Age itself. Most everything we've studied so far is pre-Axial Age, and it is in the Axial Age that a fundamental transformation in human consciousness and culture occurs globally, and one wherein more traditional forms of mythical thought give way to the bases of both philosophy and religion, as they have been known since. The term Axial Age was first coined by German psychologist and philosopher Karl Jaspers, and Armstrong is a significant expert on the concept and has written a separate book on the Axial Age as a whole. In her chapter on the Axial Age in A Short History of Myth, get just the basic outlines. From 900 to 200 BCE in 4 distinct regions, the great world traditions that have continued to nourish humanity came into being: Confucianism and Taoism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. This was also the period of the Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Jeremiah, and the mystics of the Upanishads, Mencius and Euripides. During this period of intense creativity, spiritual and philosophical geniuses pioneered an entirely new kind of human experience. Around the world at this time, human beings were looking for more spiritual forms of self-development that did not rely so heavily on external rituals and practices. They developed new concern for individual conscience and morality, critiques of their societies, as well as an ethic of compassion and justice, teaching their disciples to look into themselves for truth and not always to rely on the teaching of priests and religious experts. A major area of human cultural life they subjected to reinterpretation and reevaluation was, of course, mythology. Armstrong mentions that we don't know why nothing comparable developed in earlier civilizations such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. But actually there are many Egyptologists who argue that either the Axial Age is flawed as a hypothesis or that its renovations came earlier to Egypt, such as in Akhenaten. Assyrian and Babylonian cultures by the 6th century BCE was highly militarized, and so no need to explain its absence there. Armstrong does, however, posit that the Axial Age revolution came early to China. This is the one part in her book where she discusses Chinese myth, which we'll look at in a moment. In regards to traditional religious myth, the Axial Age can be defined as an era of the loss of traditional forms of the sacred and the invention of new ones. Recall that earlier Armstrong had posited an original unity of people with their gods and sacred experiences in the Paleolithic, which was split in the Neolithic into competing earth and sky-based religions, and then underwent a civilizing process, the city and the empire. During the Axial period, again, all those developments prove hollow. The gods withdraw, the sacred conceals itself, and myth again transforms. I find this way of framing the Axial Age to be a bit of a grand meta-narrative, and in Armstrong it seems designed to support a Judeo-Christian Islamic view of sacred history, as we'll see in a minute. Some students in the class will be presenting on the chapter on Chinese myth and culture in our textbook, and I would advise them to also read Armstrong's pages on Chinese myth. The earlier than Axial Age Chinese mythical narratives are anthologized in various parts of the 5 classics, especially the Book of Songs. The I Ching as well could be read as a work of philosophical myth. Armstrong speaks of China's high culture during the earlier than Axial Age dynasties, and how they did not so much tell stories about the gods, but worshipped nature, the ancestors, and the sky god, later Tian. The main event in this chapter by Armstrong is her more informed account of Axial Age developments in Judaism. This is the period within Judaism of the birth of a strict monotheism, as well as the earliest formation of the Hebrew Bible. Note, I'm also going to skip over Armstrong's more general account of Greek tragedy as an Axial Age development, because I teach that subject more extensively in other courses such as philosophy and literature. On early Israelite religion, Armstrong remarks that for centuries the Israelites had enjoyed the ritual and mythical life of the Near East, worshipping Asherah, Baal, and Ishtar alongside their own god, Yahweh. But now, in the context of the Babylonian and Assyrian exiles and captivities and the first great diaspora of Jewish culture, after the periods of the kingdoms of Israel and Judea, prophets such as Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel undertook a radical re-envisioning of old anthropomorphic myth. elevating Yahweh to a towering transcendence. Over and against the triviality of the old tales, it is in the Hebrew prophets that we find the first fully explicit statements of Jewish monotheism. You might be more used to associating Jewish monotheism with the Ten Commandments of Moses, but keep in mind that the covenantal injunction that the Jewish people should have no other God than Him, Yahweh, is at the same time a tacit acknowledgement that there are other gods. In this way, a special relationship between Yahweh and the Jewish people certainly predates the Axial Age, but it is only during the Axial Age that this ancient injunction takes on the explicit form of a monotheistic principle and routs the other gods and myths of early Israelite worship. During this period, mythical culture heroes such as Joshua, David, King Josiah are shown violently suppressing local pagan cults, and the effigies of Baal or Marduk are ridiculed. Myth had ceased to give the Jewish people its intimation of transcendence, and the institution of a strict monotheism becomes a social and theological struggle. Before long, these religious uncertainties and distress give way to serene confidence, and the religion that we know as Judaism comes into being. Armstrong writes, "We can see this new spirit in the first chapter of Genesis, probably written by a member of the so-called priestly school, which can be read as a poised, calm polemic against the old belligerent cosmogonies." Fascinatingly, both Armstrong and the textbook concur in reading Genesis 1 as an explicit critique, or looking askance at Babylonian creation myth, specifically the Enuma Elish. To those unfamiliar with biblical history, the idea that Genesis 1 may have been written with a contrast in mind to the Babylonian Enuma Elish and its hero Marduk might be fairly startling, and the implications are indeed far-reaching for Western culture and society. The Axial Age staging two major skirmishes and battles with traditional myth and religion, one in Greece where philosophy and the origin of scientific method take the traditional myths of Hesiod and Homer to task, and the other in the Middle East, where prophets and priestly writers set the religious and historical foundations of the Hebraic faith. Western culture can be described as a fusion or melding of Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian culture. So fascinatingly, both owe their origin to the limitation of myth. Armstrong writes, "Unlike Marduk, Israel's God does not have to fight desperate battles to create the world. He brings all things into existence effortlessly by a simple command. The sea monster in Genesis is no Tiamat, but God's creature and does his bidding. While Marduk's victory over chaos and Tiamat has to be renewed annually, Yahweh's creative act is so superior to Marduk's that it never needs to be repeated or renewed. On the seventh day in Genesis 1, Yahweh simply rests, his work complete." Genesis 1 thus represents a refinement of the victory Jewish monotheism in 2nd Isaiah. For there, Isaiah evokes an ancient creation myth that depicts Yahweh fighting sea monsters to bring the world into being, slightly more Marduk-like Yahweh, who shows his divine strength over the forces of chaos, and thus has the power to reverse the exile and captivity, bringing the Jewish people home. Prophetic era and the birth of Jewish monotheism nicely sets up our textbook's chapter for this week on Genesis. While traditionally all 5 books of the Torah are attributed to Moses, biblical scholars have observed that there are at least 3 different authors between 950 and 550 BCE. These are the Yehovist or Yahwist, Elohist, and priestly authors, respectively. For the most part, the Yahwist, Elohist sources are quoted together, in contrast to the priestly source. In regards to Genesis 1, which is a priestly source, scholars argue whether in the beginning God created heaven and earth, or a creation ex nihilo, should be rather interpreted as in the beginning, when God created heaven and earth, the earth was without form and void. If this is correct, the priestly author does not in fact portray God as creating from nothing, but as creating from previously existing elements. This leads into many theological discussions regarding the createdness versus the eternity of the world. Now, unless you've studied the Bible before, you may not know that there are major disparities between Genesis 1, the priestly author, and Genesis 2, the Yahwist or Elohist author, although these are seldom noted outside biblical scholarship. The priestly author appears to derive his view of creation from the culture of the Jews during the Babylonian captivity. Let's look at some of the major points of comparison between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In the priestly account, God says, "Let us make man in our image." So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Does this mean that God is both male and female, androgynous, rather than simply gender neutral or prior to gender? We don't know, for all we hear about in the priestly source is that human beings are theomorphized, not whether God can be anthropomorphized. Second question, does this mean that when God created man and woman, he created them at the same time? And that Eve is already created here? Or perhaps some precursor wife of Adam, such as Lilith, who has been redacted out of Genesis 1? Or does it perhaps mean the Adam Kadmon, or primal man, was himself originally an androgyne before being subdivided into Adam and Eve? We simply don't know the answer to any of these questions. In any case, in Genesis 1 to 2:4a, humans are created last after God has prepared the world for them. In Genesis 2 to 3, in the Yahwist Elohist account, we find a different anthropogony. God forms man of the dust from the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. This is the first man created from the ground, Adama, although not named Adam until a little bit later, and woman is created subsequently. This text points out that woman, Isha, incorporates the rib of man, Ish, just as our word woman incorporates the word man. Eve is not mentioned until 320, when its meaning mother of the living is emphasized by a pun on Hawa. Eve sounds like hey, life. The textbook points out two parenting style, the transcendent, clean the garage on Saturday, versus the immanent, let's do it together. And we can compare here Van Amali on the immanence versus the transcendence of the Divine Mother. Like the God of the Bible, Devi enacts both parenting styles, but the immanent style wins out in specific devotional situations. The God of the priestly writer seems a bit more transcendent. Let there be light. Although this God is also involved in fashioning the universe, the textbook points out that the God of the J.E. writer seems to have a few more immanent touches. His creation from ground and breath is more earthy, and he walks in the garden in the cool of day, playing with them on occasions such as in Adam's renaming of everything in creation, and he clothes Adam and Eve directly. Still, you could say that the God in Genesis 2 to 4 still has touches of transcendence, leaving Adam and Eve fairly well to their own devices, at least until they violate his prohibition. The textbook goes into significantly more detail on how the priestly source refutes the cosmogony of Babylon, as well as on the second Genesis story versus the first, and it gives us a helpful chart with which we can map these differences in terms of concern, the landscape of creation, the order of creation, the nature of humans, and their respective views on God. The second chapter in the textbook on Genesis is based on the biblical myth of the flood. Again, like in Genesis 1 to 3, there are two different narratives woven together from the respective priestly and Yahwist Elohist sources, which we can recognize because they use two different Hebrew words for flood. And again, the priestly source seems more influenced by the Mesopotamian view that the earth had been created out of a watery waste or primordial chaos, and describes the flood not as rain, but as a release of part of the world's structure, the ocean above the firmament. The length of the flood as well differs between the priestly and Yahwist Elohist sources. In terms of religious meaning, the priestly writer speaks of the covenantal agreement between God and humans, and the progress humans can now make in their relationship with a slightly more transcendent God. The Yahwist Elohist source represents God in a more anthropomorphic way. God is grieved to his heart at the wickedness of humans, and he plays a role in shutting Noah into the ark in order to save him. These details from the textbook chapter could help us to look back at the Atrahasis hymn and compare the different roles that the god Enlil and the god Enki play in that earlier version of the flood myth. The covenant with God established in both versions is a promise of protection to human beings forever. And this is what most distinguishes the biblical flood myths from the earlier Mesopotamian versions. A covenant is a formal agreement between God and his people with obligations on each side. The extension of protection by God is to be reciprocated by the acceptance of certain obligations to God on the part of humans who enter into the covenant. In fact, the accounts of covenant formation in Genesis seem to be modeled on political relationships established between a great king and his subordinates. By such an agreement, Hebrew berit, the vassal or subordinate obtains protection from the Lord in exchange for the obligation to fulfill his commands. God's covenant with Noah, which is a bit more formal in the priestly account but not absent from the Yahwist Elohist one, is the first explicit covenant in the Hebrew Bible. Earlier implicit covenants might be read into God's clothing Adam and Eve after leaving the garden and protecting Cain from retaliation for his crime. These could all be considered precursor covenants to the one that God makes with Abraham in Genesis 17 and with Moses in Exodus 31. Although framed a little differently in the Yahwist and the priestly source, the outcome of the covenant with Noah and his descendants seems to involve a loosening of certain religious prohibitions as well as an acceptance by God that human beings will never be fully perfect. We're going to pivot now to the Agha-Jaffar chapters on Lilith, Eve, and Mary. Of course, in any world religion class or Old Testament class, coverage of the formation and historical development of Judaism would be far more extensive. For example, we won't be covering Abrahamic and Mosaic historical myth, nor the early Israelite kingdoms of Israel and Judea beyond what we've already said, nor the Persian, Hellenic, and Roman occupations of Israel-Palestine, or the formation of rabbinical Judaism, nor the gradual separation of Christianity from its Judaic roots after 70 CE. Nor next will we be covering the richly symbolic, equally mythic and mystical materials in the later history of Kabbalistic Judaism. You can study that stuff in our Great Mystics of the World class. Here, and in light of our course's focus again on women and goddesses in world myth, we will cover a few mythic narratives concerning Lilith and Eve in the Hebrew Bible and the Virgin Mary in the New Testament, as well as just briefly touching on other forms of the divine feminine that were worshipped within early Gnostic Christianity before it was suppressed. Agha-Jaffar begins her introductory remarks on Lilith by noting that it is difficult to generalize on the position of women in contemporary Judaism, since its forms are diverse, ranging from ultra-Orthodox to Reform and Reconstructionist positions. In early rabbinical Judaism, however, Agha-Jaffar locates a predominantly hostile attitude towards women. They are, quote, inferior creatures dependent on men, not allowed to study scripture or participate in public ritual. It is fairly far-fetched but possible that in Genesis 1, Lilith was also created in God's image along with man, and that Lilith is thus Adam's first wife. Far-fetched or not, this became a rabbinical and then a modern myth. Indeed, references to Lilith as Eve's predecessor appear in the Talmud, Midrash, and the Kabbalah from 200 CE to 1200 CE as well. Agha-Jaffar passes over quickly other sources for Lilith and Ben Sirah's alphabet, so we'll spend a little time going over them. The name Lilith is related to the Hebrew word Layla, night, and she is a demon who preys on male desire and is responsible for infant mortality. She may have been known to the Canaanites during the 7th to 8th century BCE, based on this inscription, quote, to her that flies in rooms of darkness, pass quickly, quickly, Lilith. In the Hebrew Bible, or Torah, there is only one reference to Lilith in Isaiah 34:14. There she is among the beasts of prey and spirits that will lay waste to the land on the day of vengeance. In the Talmud, Lilith appears as a female demon with a woman's face, long hair, and wings. A man sleeping in a house alone may be seized by Lilith. Recently, Lilith has been identified as a demon in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Note, these depictions so far are consistent with the idea of Lilitu as the demon who infects Inanna's tree in the Sumerian Hulupu tree tale. In some versions of her myth in Midrashic literature, Adam meets Lilith later in his tale after having parted from his wife Eve. Adam is seduced by her in this myth and bears her male and female demons. A transmuted version of the Lilith myth appears in the alphabet of Ben Sirah, which is Agha-Jaffar's primary source here. It is a midrash from the 18th to the 11th century, which sets out to explain the widespread custom of writing amulets against Lilith. It is here that she is identified with the first Eve, who, unwilling to forego her equality with Adam, disputes the form that their sexual intercourse will take, while pronouncing the ineffable name of God before she flies off into the air, thereby abandoning Adam. On Adam's request, God sends after her 3 angels, whose entreaties to compromise with Adam she refuses, and it is here that she becomes again a goddess of infant mortality, although one that offers protection to those children who wear her amulet. From these ancient traditions, the image of Lilith was fixed in Kabbalistic demonology, as well as in Jewish folk custom. A Lilith is one who seduces fathers away from the Adam-Eve structure of the filial bond or nuclear family, thereby producing illegitimate babies. And this is mostly how Lilith appears in the Zohar. In Lilith's role as a seducer, she's often been associated with the Queen of Sheba or the Devil's Dame in popular culture and imagination. So it is to Lilith that we owe the notion of Satan's grandmother in German folklore as well. Back to Agha-Jaffar and Lilith. She notes that both rabbinic and Kabbalistic sources present her image designed to instill fear and loathing. And yet her characterization is complex. She plays essential roles in God's creation, and yet is strongly associated with sexuality and death. The tone and purpose of the wisdom or alphabet of Ben Sirah needs to be taken into account as well. This is a genre of rabbinical writing that is irreverent and full of scatological humor, bodily functions, sex, vulgarity, obscenities, and absurdities. It seems to have been a genre of academic burlesque among some rabbis, or a parody of sacred materials and commentary that served as entertaining distraction for rabbinic scholars. Its author, Ben Sirah, is a very strange quasi-prophetic figure with an unusual conception story. According to legend, Ben Sirah was born with a full set of teeth and the power of speech, a bit like the baby Jesus who speaks from the cradle in Surah 19 of the Quran. A monstrous or prodigious child, Sirah goes on to a career as a court advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. In this context that the king asks for an explanation of the meaning of the Lilith amulet that had saved his son. And Sirah explains to the king Lilith's creation from the same earthly substance as her illustrious male counterpart, Adam, as well as other interesting and sundry details of the Lilith myth. Agha-Jaffar comments that in refusing Yahweh's offer through the marriage counselor angels, as it were, Lilith repudiates all forms of male authority and refuses subservience and submission. She is not afraid of committing the most heinous crime of abandonment. A more rather than less uniformly vilified figure throughout her appearances in rabbinical history, she has nevertheless become a symbol of feminist revolt, a new modern myth. Indeed, as Agha-Jaffar writes, the story of Lilith, as told in the alphabet, has enjoyed a wide resurgence of interest in modern culture, and modern feminists embrace Lilith as a symbol of female empowerment. Reimagined as a sympathetic being who dares to challenge the patriarchal paradigm that systematically seeks to circumscribe her rights and the rights of all women to self-determination and autonomy. She has become a role model for female autonomy, independence, equality, strength, and courage. The second figure we'll be looking at a bit more in detail is Eve in Genesis 2-3. Agha-Jaffar begins her comments with a review of the J.E. versus priestly sources that we've already covered above. Agha-Jaffar also points out the elements of gender hierarchy in Genesis 2. It is Adam who God allows to name all things, a renaming that establishes his authority and hierarchy, man over animal and soon man over woman. Seeing that the solitary condition is inappropriate for Adam, God decides to provide him with a companion by inaugurating a tradition that defines woman as a dangerous plaything. Agha-Jaffar also focuses in on the scene of Eve and the serpent in the garden, and notes that Eve's own awareness of God's prohibition against eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil has only been communicated to Eve through hearsay, not directly from God. In allowing herself to be persuaded by the serpent, Eve demonstrates 3 stages of higher order thinking. 1, the fruit is good for food. 2, the fruit is pleasing, a delight to the eyes. And 3, the fruit will satisfy a thirst for godlike knowledge. It is desired to make one wise. Agha-Jaffar comments that Eve's character here is extremely complex. She is intelligent, independent, decision-making, and she has self-improvement intent. In contrast, Adam's characterization is more simplistic. Adam's thought patterns are more basic, and later he even shifts responsibility for his actions onto Eve. And we should ask here, why has the serpent been so readily identified with Satan or Lucifer? This is very much a later theological interpretation, those characters not being mentioned in Genesis. So what are other possible, even if unorthodox, interpretations, and how might the serpent in Inanya's tale fit in here? Could it be that in listening to the serpent but not to Adam, Eve is somehow choosing an ancestral cult of the mother goddess, or of Inanna, who was a goddess of serpents, and thereby rejecting the arbitrary prohibitions of Adam and Yahweh's male-parsed religious order? In any case, in Genesis 2-3, shame at nudity and a recognition of sexual differentiation and bickering seem to be the result of eating the forbidden fruit. When God interviews Adam and Eve on account of their misdeeds, Eve takes responsibility without implicating her partner or the deity in her transgression. The serpent tricked me, and I ate, she says. That Eve recognizes a power of evil or trickery in the serpent, and that God punishes and curses the serpent, does not negate possible heterodox interpretations. The expulsion from the garden into the accursed earth of pain and sorrow, childbirth and alienated labor, yet comes with clearly articulated and God-ordained gender roles. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, he shall rule over you. This is when Adam renames Eve the mother of all the living. Agha-Jaffar comments that the nature of both the naming and the renaming suggests that the female has been denied an autonomous identity since she has been defined exclusively in terms of her relationship with others. And lastly, the third character of the divine feminine we find in Judeo-Christian myth that we'll be covering this week is the Virgin Mary. Again, since this is not a world religion, New Testament, or history of ancient or modern Christianity class, all of which are offered by the department, we won't be covering much of myth versus fact when it comes to the historical Jesus, or the highly diverse literatures that sprung up in his name, and the history of Christian theology and civilization from 200 to 1500 CE. However, since the Virgin Mary is so central to the Western mythical imagination and religious consciousness, we will be looking at some of the scriptures associated with her in their relevance for the mother archetype worship and the history of Christian faith. Of the three synoptic gospels, Luke is known as the woman's gospel because women and their viewpoints figure more prominently there. Jesus' mother, Miriam or Maria, the Virgin Mary, but also Mary Magdalene. Agha-Jaffar comments that Luke emphasizes that although Mary was well aware of the social humiliation and stigmatization associated with being pregnant and unwed, she accepts her fate with equanimity. Her response is unequivocal submission to the will of God. The Magnificat is Mary's longest speech in the New Testament and reverberates with words from the Old Testament. In it, she praises God for selecting her as a recipient of his blessings and situates God's actions as part of a larger context. Mary also appears in Luke as a chastising mother of Jesus and Jesus as a dismissive son, and this has caused much debate. The Catholic Church presents 4 dogmas concerning the Virgin Mary. 1, she is the mother of God. 2, she conceived Jesus with her virginity intact. 3, she conceived through Immaculate Conception, which was not declared dogma until 1854, and she was assumed into heaven in both body and soul, declared dogma only in 1950. As the Mother of God in the form of Christ, for Christians, Mary's quality have paralleled many of the qualities of the great goddess over the centuries. Like the great goddess, Mary gives birth to a divine child. She conceives parthenogenetically, that is, without male insemination. She is associated with fertility and purportedly bestows fecundity to her devotees through shrines and relics, and the celebration of her divine son displaces the celebration of previous sons of the divine goddess in the calendar year and festivals. As the goddess's son or consort dies and is resurrected, so the Son of Mary dies and is resurrected. In her capacity as the mother of sorrows, she weeps because of her son's suffering and sacrifice, and she recalls the goddess in her different cultural manifestations as the bereaved mother who has lost her beloved child. Images of Mary Jesus take over images of Isis and Horus, and finally, Mary is known as the Queen of Heaven, a title once belonging to Inanna of ancient Sumer, among others. So what are the differences between Mary and the Mother Goddess? What is completely different is that Mary is a human woman, not a deity. The monotheistic vision of Christianity has no room for a goddess, comments Agha-Jaffar. She is an exceptional mortal who undoubtedly plays a pivotal role in the birth of a god, but she is a mortal nevertheless. The goddess is grounded in earth and nature. The Virgin Mary, through her Immaculate Conception and virgin birth, transcends nature. Images of the great goddess are often potent symbols of sexuality, autonomy, and procreativity. Images of Mary, on the other hand, serve as potent symbols of chastity, purity, and submission to the will of a higher power. On the history of Mary worship, Agha-Jaffar notes that although goddess worship was severely suppressed over many generations, it never disappeared entirely from view. And Agha-Jaffar points to the global phenomena of the Black Virgin or Black Madonna, and we could add that many indigenous and mestiza post-colonial communities openly worship Mary as a deity. Eastern Christian traditions as well reserve a special place for Mother Mary alongside the Trinity as the Theotokos, or Mother of God. Indeed, the tenacity with which both men and women have clung to an image of a compassionate and merciful feminine deity satisfies a human hunger for reassuring, nurturing, encompassing Mother of all figures. Here on the right, you can see the most famous Virgin Mary shrine in Lourdes, which has become a central pilgrimage site for Catholics all over the world. So we're going to look at one last myth of the divine feminine in early Judeo-Christian mythology this week. Also interesting to study, but we don't have time, is the Jewish figure Hokmah, often syncretized in Jewish and Christian Gnostic scripture to the goddess Sophia or Barbella, who is in turn sometimes associated with Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Martha. For more on this, you can look up Max Deschu's article, The Gnostic Goddess, Female Power, and the Fallen Sophia. One Gnostic scripture in particular, and the last one we'll look at this week, was discovered in the Nag Hammadi library. Its title is Thunder, or the Perfect Mind. What is so fascinating about this text is that it is written in the Christian tradition in the first person, purportedly by a female deity and one with many self-proclaimed identities. Later in the text we read, I am the Sophia of the Greeks and the Gnosis of the barbarians. I am the one whose image is great in Egypt, i.e. Isis. Sometimes understood as Phusis herself or Mother Nature, this great goddess from the ancient world says directly in the hymn, I was sent out from the power and have come to you who study me, and am found by you who seek me. Look at me, you who study me, and you who hear me, hear me. You waiting for me, take me into yourself. Don't banish me from your vision. Don't let hatred enter your voice against me, or let anger enter your hearing. In no place, in no time, be unknowing of me, be alert. Don't be ignorant of me. And she goes on, I am the first and the last. I am the honored and the scorned. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the members of my mother. I am the barren one, and many are her sons. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent, and the word whose appearance is multiple. I am the utterance of my name. The concluding words of Thunder then read, Look at his words and all the writings completed. Be alert, hearers and angels, and those sent, and you spirits risen from the dead. I alone exist and have no one to judge me. Many pleasures exist in many sins, uncontrolled passion and disgraceful desires, and brief pleasures embraced by people until they sober up and float up to their place of rest. Then they will find me and live and will not die again. Leave the interpretation of this complex and fascinating poem up to you this week. I hope you enjoyed it and this unit. Okay, have a good week everyone, and see you next week.